We're going to talk about one of the more important things that the writer of Hebrews is going to share with us so that we have a better understanding of what we have in Jesus. If you recall, the very basis of Hebrews is the fact that people were ready to give up Jesus to go back to whatever their religious system was. To them it was being a Jew, an Israelite. To us it may be something different. That we all have our philosophy about worship, about salvation, and too many have substituted a religious theory for the person that can save us. One of the main things that we need to understand in our life today, and we're going on the assumption that being right with God is the most important thing as a human being that we can have. Okay? If my relationship to Jesus is not what it should be, then as Danny said, even though I hate to admit that Danny does say worthwhile things sometimes, his life is useless. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen in our society today. The hopelessness that is there for so many people and their attempt to substitute. You know, many, many times I share with people that inside of us is an emptiness in our hearts, and that is God-shaped, and nothing else is going to satisfy that hurt, that need, that emptiness that we have. So the problem is that we need a mediator. We need somebody to go between us, because whether we'll accept this or not, whether we'll admit it or not, we are evil, wicked, sinful people. Even today, as we meet as Christians, we are evil and wicked. That is within our nature. So to think that we can have some kind of relationship with God in that kind of situation without a mediator is absurd. Okay? So what we see here is that we need a mediator. We say there's a gap between us and God. There's a canyon between us and God. Now you take this holy God and sinful man, how in the world can we ever come back together? And our only answer is we can't. There is no hope at all except in Jesus himself. So what happens, and we'll go through a really quick Old Testament study here. God creates Adam and Eve. And what happens with Adam and Eve? Okay, they sin. And we need to keep in mind it was the woman's fault. See what we just did? No lunch for you today. I think he's holding your hand to keep you from hitting. No, it was a joint effort, it was, okay? And what happens is, the first thing that Adam and Eve enjoyed was walking with God, and then after they have committed this sin, what's the one thing that they do? They try to hide from God. And I would suggest that that's where most of the people in our world today are, trying to hide from him, to pretend. God comes and says, where are you? It's not because God didn't know where they were at, because he wanted them to realize where they were at. For the first time, they're behind a tree. They're hiding. Okay? And then we get into Genesis chapter 4. What is the main subject of chapter 4? Cain and Abel. And I cannot fathom the thinking in Adam and Eve's mind is that when Cain kills Abel, it was their fault. They introduced this whole thing. I can't imagine what that must have been going through their minds to realize that what they did, the result was the murder of one of their sons. So what happens then, we go through into the wickedness of the world. Genesis chapter 5 continues to repeat these people's names, and at the end of those names it says, and he died. Not just physically, but spiritually, that we can die now because we're separated from God. So finally in chapter 6, what does God decide to do? The flood, destroy the world. And there's a passage there that says that God was sorry that he created man. Okay? So we see our sinfulness, and then as soon as we go through the flood, the evilness of mankind comes right back, because the next thing that we see is going to be the Tower of Babel. And that's more than we're going to go into today. And finally in chapter 12, God attempts to embrace a certain family, and on the scene comes a man named Abraham. And Abraham was a man of faith, as imperfect as we are, but he was a man of faith, and he had sons, Isaac and Jacob. Okay? And these people, Jacob's going to be changed to Israel. We see because of all the problems of famine. How many of you listened to my radio program this morning? You heard that about them? How many of you remember what I said this morning? See, there's no hands going up there. Okay. But anyway, it is Joseph then that, because the famine brings his family there, and out of Joseph who rises Moses. Okay? So God uses Moses to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. And in the process of that, what happens is that Moses has a brother named Aaron. And that God appoints Aaron as high priest. And through the tribe of Levi, you're going to see the priest come forward. The book of the Bible that's entitled Leviticus, Levi, what the priests are going to do as far as the Mosaic covenant is concerned. Okay? So Aaron is the high priest, and through that are going to be his children. But we need a mediator. That's what Aaron was all about. As imperfect as he was, we're going to get to that. In fact, what we are introduced here in Hebrews 4 is going to go all the way through to Hebrews 8, because this is an important point, okay? If I can take you back to Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, the last part of that verse says what? Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. God has separated, or we have separated ourselves from God. And then the calling upon the name of the Lord somewhere got defined as praying. It's far more than that. It's about worshiping. Okay? That there's going to be altars that are going to be established now. There's going to be acts of worship that are going to take place because we have been separated from God because of our sin. And we need someone to stand between God and us. Because if we don't, we're destroyed. You know, one of the philosophies of the day is that if I live my life and I'll try to be good in my life, and I'll do more good than bad in my life, and then God's going to say, that's great, come on into heaven. Okay? That is a doctrine of demons. That is a message from Satan. That we are saved by grace here. We need somebody in between us, okay? So if you look at Hebrews chapter 4, we're going to go through this in 3 sections. We'll see how much time that we have. The people of Menard may just have to wait. Well, actually they do until I get there, but anyway, wait longer. Look at verse 14 of Hebrews chapter 4. And right now we're going to read 14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, just as a quick reference here, we're not going to spend any time on this. The time of need can be translated just in the nick of time. And that just at the right time, when we are in great need, that we can turn to this high priest, and that because of who he is, that he is superior in sympathy. What is sympathy? Do you think it's a trick question? What is sympathy?
You feel bad for other people in the
You
situation
feel
you're in. Bad.
Bad, okay. Okay. Anybody? She is correct, as bad as I hate to admit that, Mary, but anyway, there's more to it. I have learned a long time ago there's a big difference between feeling sorry for someone and feeling sorry with someone. For them, you put yourself outside the situation. With them, you're involved in the situation. Okay? Good Samaritan. It says he has sympathy upon the man who was beaten up. Sympathy is not just feeling bad or feeling sorry for someone. It is stepping in to alleviate the problem. It is going to find some way of taking care of the situation in which they are in. The Good Samaritan did that, did he not? Jesus did that, did he not? That not only did he look down upon us and see the great need we had, he fulfilled that need. That's what the cross is all about, the forgiveness of sin. But the mediation that he's going to be able to help us with. Life is often confusing, is it not? Okay? And sometimes in the midst of all the things we go through, we kind of lose our bearings sometimes. We lose that anchor that holds us in the right direction. That is who Jesus is. And when he looks down upon us in the midst of those times, and it's interesting as human beings, that in the worst times of our lives, we run away from God. We should be running right to Him. That's the time we need to come to Him. And I think there's a lot of misconception, and I won't go into this because I do it quite often, that we have created in our hearts and minds a God. Not the God of the Bible, but our own God. And He's going to beat us up. He's going to come down on us hard because we have failed to be the person He intended for us to be. And that is not the God of the Bible. He understands our weaknesses. He understands our temptations. Why? Yeah, he went through it. Okay? You ever heard of that phrase, been there, done that? Okay? That when the temptations in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, the Garden of Gethsemane, that He went through those temptations, yet He was without sin. Because that was important for us also, that He be this perfect sacrifice for us. So He sympathizes with our weaknesses. He was tempted just as we are. And when we come to God, what does the writer of Hebrews refer to the throne of God as what? The throne of, in verse 16. Grace. And we can find grace. If I understood the true nature of God, what did you expect to find there at the throne of God? He is a God of grace all the way through, okay? And by the way, I appreciate it, Bob Russell that originally said that I quoted from him. That we yell out grace, but we whisper repentance. And without repentance, grace is not applied to me. Okay? It's a very essential thing. And that what we need to understand here, that we should expect that grace. That we have to have a better understanding of the nature of God. Who is He? He is not a father that wants to beat us. He's not a police officer that wants to arrest us. But He also isn't a grandfather that says everything we do is okay either. Okay? But we have to have this idea of the grace. Okay? We should expect that. In John chapter 8, the first 11 verses deals with this woman that was taken in adultery. Okay? What did Jesus show to her? The Pharisees and the people came and they were going to stone her to death, right? And sometimes I think that's how we see God. Boy, I messed up. He's going to hit me over the head, and that's going to be the end of that. But what did Jesus do? He showed her grace. Grace. He didn't condone what she was doing. Because the very last thing that He says to her is go and leave your life of sin. Okay? But in the midst of that, who is there that condemns you? Everybody gone. Nobody. Nobody. And the one person in that whole situation that could have condemned her chose not to do that, but chose to show her grace. In the story, what I think is a great story of the nature of God, the prodigal son. We know the story that he was very rude to his dad. You know, when he tells his father that he wants half his inheritance, he is saying to his father, I wish you were dead. You're no longer bring value to me. I want what's mine. And what does the father do? He gives it to him. And he goes out and he does all these sinful things. He comes back home. What does the father do?
Runs to him.
He runs to him. He sees him from far away. And when he gets up to him, what does he do? Hugs him. Okay? That's the God that we worship. Not that He condones whatever we want to do, but He is there to be gracious. How many times have you experienced God's grace in your life? How many times did you really, really mess up? But instead of condemning you, God showed you the way of forgiveness. And that's the kind of God we have. And that's the Jesus who our high priest is there because He wants to give us grace. The greatest help that we can receive in any situation is from someone who's already experienced that. Okay? I found this cute little story. It'll take just a few moments to tell it. But there was this little boy that he is 9 years old, and he's sitting in class. And he doesn't know what has happened, but all he knows is there's a puddle of water beneath the seat in front of his pants are all wet. He said, oh man, how could that happen? I've never wet my pants before. So he doesn't know what to do. And he's afraid that the kids are going to see him, they're going to make fun of him. He's afraid the teacher's going to see him, and she's going to come back and jerk him out of class, and this is going to be a horrible experience. And all at once the teacher does get up and comes walking toward him. And he thinks, oh man, this is it, this is over with. But in the process of that time, there's a little girl named Susan that goes over to a desk not far away and picks up a fishbowl and begins to walk over this little boy. And when she gets there, she trips. teacher's attitude has changed. He's a victim now. And it's the Susan little girl that gets all the score now because she spilled all that water all over him. They don't have to find him some clothes and just go through, and boy, the kids give Susan a really hard time. They scorn her the rest of the day. And when they get on the bus, nobody wants to sit with Susan. And a little boy walks over to her and sits down beside her. And she says, I want to thank you for what you did. And Sue says, I wet my pants. Jesus has experienced what we're going through. And we can look around and say, nobody understands what I'm going through. I know one person that does. And obviously, the good part about that, he's the one that can solve the problem. He's the one that can resolve all the guilt, the harm, the hurt. And that's what we need to turn to. So why don't we? And I'm sure that that's a question that's asked many, many times because of who he is. He is an approachable high priest. See, just the opposite thing was happening. If you read the Gospels, if you read the Old Testament, the priesthood became separate. Okay? I don't want to get in trouble here, but exactly what we see is happening to the government. They become elitist. They no longer understand what we're going through. They separate themselves from us. Jesus was not that way. It wasn't the fact that he could separate himself. He could, but he chose not to. That we can approach the throne of God how? With confidence. Because of who the high priest is. Because of who is sitting on that throne. That he is someone that loves us more than anyone has ever loved us. And he is there to have us come to him. And we can have that mercy and that grace to help us in a time of need. Dennis the Menace hasn't been around for quite some time, I guess, but there's a cartoon. Now you know how old I am. Okay? No comments, please. But Dennis the Menace, and he has a little friend, Joey, and next door to them live the Wilsons. Okay? So Mrs. Wilson comes out and gives Joey and Dennis some cookies. And as they're walking away, Joey says, I wonder what we did to deserve these cookies. And Dennis the Menace says, Joey, you have to understand, we have these cookies not because we're nice, but because she is nice. We don't have the forgiveness of sin because we're good, because he's good. That through the grace and mercy he has given us that forgiveness. That he's approachable. He's approachable, that we can go to him. And in fact, not getting too far off point here, but in his prayer in John 17, Jesus says he wants these people to have the same relationship to him as he has with the Father. Now that's something that's not foreign to us, but it sure was to the Jew, because God was a million miles away. Nobody went to God except the priest that he did the work in the temple. But Jesus said, this is what I want. I want these people, us, to have the same friendship with Jesus that Jesus has with the Father. Now, if that's impossible, why would he pray that? It's not impossible. It's not impossible that we can have that closeness. He's approachable. God is approachable, and that we need to understand that very thing. So in chapter 5, as we have talked about Jesus' superior in sympathy, we're going to talk about he's superior in selection. Why did he become high priest? Okay? Why did God choose him when they had Aaron and those things? Let's read the first 4 verses of chapter 5. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. No one takes this honor himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So here we have this connection between Jesus and Aaron, and the qualifications of a high priest in the Old Testament here that he shares with them. Both Jesus and Aaron were appointed as priests by God. But the difference is what? Pardon me?
He is
perfect. Okay, that's correct. He is the Son. He's not a servant over here like Aaron was. He is his son. And he'll go into that here in just a few verses. That we have to understand the problem with the high priest was that he had to make a sacrifice for his own sins first, before he could offer the sacrifices for the people. And another problem that they had with the high priest is kept dying. And then we had to get another one, and another one. And the third problem that you had, eventually it becomes a political situation. At the time that Jesus is arrested, they take him to see Annas, and then they take him to see Caiaphas. And it says that he was high priest that year. Well, see, what happened is Rome took control of Israel, and if the high priest wasn't somebody they really liked, they just took him out, put somebody else in. And it became a very political thing, very much so. So we see how corrupted, and we can look back and say, well, that's terrible, Joe's terrible. But just for a moment, can we stop and think about how we have corrupted this thing called Christianity? How we have corrupted and distorted the truth in so many different ways. It's no different. It's no different. We need a high priest that is perfect for us. And that's the problem we had here. That any way that Aaron could offer, now I'm using him because he was the first high priest, but there's still those problems. He was sinful just like the people were. He had to offer sacrifice for himself, and then he kept dying and had to get somebody else. Okay? How distorted it all became here. But in the process here, we will see as we read the rest of this passage, if you will look in verse 5, and we'll go through to verse 10. So Christ did not take upon himself the glory of becoming high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Who in the world is Melchizedek? Now we're going to hear more about him in Hebrews 7. Okay? And we go way back to Genesis, way back to Abraham. And there was a time that Lot, his nephew, got caught up in some kind of war, got taken prisoner up in the northern part of Israel. And Abraham goes up to save him. And when he gets him and comes back, as they go through Salem, which is another name for Jerusalem, that Melchizedek, the high priest of Salem, comes. And what does Abraham do? He gives him tithes and offerings. Who in the world is Melchizedek? He is going to use this argument with Melchizedek, who predates the priesthood of the Jews, who is no beginning and no end. We'll talk more about that as a symbol of this Jesus that he's talking about. It was a high priest that was beyond and before the priesthood of Aaron. But even with Melchizedek, it is Jesus that he calls him his son. That he is sinless, he is in the presence of God, and he is the only son. He is an eternal priest. Not only is he eternal, he is obedient. Not only is he obedient, he is perfect. Okay? And one of the things that we can come to the conclusion is, as we read all of this, folks, is the fact that I do not need any human to intercede between God and me. Not as a Christian. In fact, one of the key ingredients of the New Testament church is the priesthood of every believer. Every one of us, as a Christian, can approach God now, just like that high priest did. That we are our own priest. No human has the authority to forgive my sin. I don't care who they are. I don't need them to intercede for me. I have Jesus to intercede for me. Paul writes to Timothy, there is only one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. So that we have that opportunity, we have the privilege of going into the very presence of God whenever we call upon him and come to that. There's no one more qualified to be a mediator than Jesus. Okay? I remember going down to Overland Park, Kansas, to see Danny when he would let me come. But he worked at this one place, I'm not going to get into all that, and they did quite a bit of work for the government. Okay? I got to see this special vision for grenade launchers that the men at night could use, and we went through this whole thing. Okay? What was interesting, what I want to bring up to you is the fact that when I went to visit with him, you're allowed to be a visitor there one time. You never can come back once you've been there. Because of what? You know, there were certain things that Danny would say, I can't tell you about that, Dad. I can't tell you about this. I can't say anything about that. Okay? But I got to go wherever I wanted to go through that whole place. Why? One reason only. I was with Danny. Okay? He had the authority to show that to me. If I would have got away from him, they would have had me out of that place like that. Okay? What I want to use as an example of Jesus, that when I'm with him, the doors are all open to me. Okay? And it's by faith that we can become a part of that. God is willing. It's us that seem to put the wall up and just not willing to submit to him. You know, we talk about being committed to Christ. I'm more concerned about being submitted to him. That we have given all these areas of our life to him. And that he is the priest that I can go to at any time. And no matter what I'm going through, he understands. He knows what it was like to be tempted. He understands everything that goes on in my life because he experienced those same temptations all through that. And finally, that he is superior in salvation. We're not going to get through all of this, and that's okay. Aaron was a high priest, and on the Leviticus chapter 16, if you would care some time to turn to that, it's about the Day of Atonement, that we would know as Yom Kippur. And it's in October here this year. It normally is somewhere around there in October. And it's the one day out of the year that the high priest was able to go into the Holy of Holies to be in the very presence of God, to offer sacrifice for the people. Okay? Aaron had two sons, Nadab and Abihu. Have you ever heard those names before? They were in charge. They were priests. They were in charge of keeping the fire burning in the tabernacle. And they're sitting around one night, around a campfire, and what happens is the fire in the temple goes out. Well, what's the big deal? We'll just take some fire from the campfire here and go into the Holy of Holies, and then we will start an entry. And when they get to the door, lightning from heaven strikes and kills both of them. In Leviticus chapter 16, what does God say to Aaron? Not just anybody can walk in here. Not just anybody is able to go to that very place, the high priest. So what would happen as high priest is all decked out in everything he needs. There's a veil that hides the rest of the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. And at one time a year, he would sacrifice this lamb, take the blood into the very presence of God in the Holy of Holies, offer that to God. And when God would accept that, then he would come back out and sprinkle the blood on the people. And then he would take a goat and put his left hand on the goat, signifying the sins of the people went to that goat, and then they would let that goat run wild for a year. That's where we get the word scapegoat. Okay? Because you see, in the Old Testament, sins were not forgiven. Okay, we'll get to that in Hebrews chapter 9. So that is what the high priest would do. Only him could he go into the very presence of God. So what happens, if you'll recall, when Jesus dies upon the cross, there's a reference that the veil in the temple split in two. That's the veil that hid the Holy of Holies, saying that every man had access to it. Every person through Christ has access into the very Holy of Holies, into the presence of God. That through his salvation, the perfect salvation that he's given us, that he could then approach God on his own. That is what we have in Jesus as a high priest. He gives me the privilege of going into the presence of God. And maybe that's not exciting to a lot of people, but it sure is to me. Because I don't know what this life would be if we did not have that opportunity, that privilege of going into the presence of God and pleading our case. The same thing happens. The barriers that kept us away from the presence of God is gone. I want to close with this thought. After the resurrection, we see two times, more than two times, but these two times, that these women came in contact with Jesus. Okay? In John chapter 20, verse 17, they go and they try to hold on to him, and what does he tell them? Do not hold on to me, I'm not yet ascended to the Father. Okay? But later on, in Matthew 28:9, they came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. What happened in between? The same thing that happened in the Old Testament with the high priest, that Jesus took his sacrifice, him, went to heaven, offered it to his Father, was accepted, came back down. And now you can worship him because his sacrifice is accepted. No one else has ever done that. Nobody else has ever experienced that same thing because he has broken down the walls. He has taken care of the gap. That through his sacrifice that we can confidently be in the presence of God. Jesus is the constant one in a life that is always changing. He's the one personally anchor that we can hold on to in the midst of all these things that are going on. So what does the writer of Hebrews say? Hold fast to him. Don't slip back into your little religious beliefs. Hold on to him, and that we can find that need that we have always, always. After the end of the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier that was sitting at a park bench outside the White House. And he was very dejected that the Union soldiers had come and taken his farm from him. And he had no way of getting it back. He tried to get in to see President Lincoln several times, but each time he tried to get in, the guard stopped him and caught him off the grounds. So he was sitting there very dejected, and this little boy comes up and says, "Sir, what's the problem?" And he explains to this little boy what his problem, what he's struggling with. And the little boy says, "Come with me." So he doesn't go to the front door of the White House, he goes around back. When the guards see him, they stand at attention, and they open the door, and he and the Confederate soldier walk in. And they go into the library, and who's in the library? But Abraham Lincoln sitting there. And then the Confederate soldier has his opportunity to talk to the president. President Lincoln signs an order to give him his farm back. And the whole story is about that the little boy that led him into the president was Tad Lincoln, the president's son. The one that brings us into the very presence of God is his son. Is his son. And because of that we hold tightly to him, because of who he is, that we can approach with confidence the throne of grace and make our needs known to God and allow God to work in our lives in a special way. But until I truly accept, sincerely accept Jesus the way the Bible says, not just anybody can walk in there, but if you're with the Son, and God is calling us to that. And that's going to be our invitation this morning, is softly and tenderly, that Jesus is calling us. Maybe we are a Christian and we see no need of accepting him now, but what about allowing him to work in our lives? Allowing him to be the high priest that intercedes for us and can bring us in his very presence whenever we have that need. Let's stand together. We're going to sing, I think it's verses 1, 2, and 4.